Report by The Guardian. Jeremy Corbyn, Theresa May is in denial about NHS. Jeremy Corbyn has accused Theresa May of being frankly in denial about the state of the NHS as he again used Prime Minister's questions to pressure her over the performance of the health service this winter. Devoting all his questions to the issue, the Labour leader said the NHS faced death by 1,000 cuts. May responded by insisting the health service was better prepared than ever for the winter, and criticising the record of the Labour-run Welsh Government on health provision. Corbyn began an often noisy PMQs by referencing reports that Boris Johnson had planned to demand the government commit to spending an extra £100 million a week on the NHS after Brexit, which saw him criticised by fellow cabinet ministers. Asked by Corbyn whether she agreed with the Foreign Secretary that the NHS needed an extra £5bn a year, May dodged the question by saying the budget had given it £6bn more. Corbyn then referenced May's claim about the health service being well prepared for winter, noting a letter from senior A&E doctors to her expressing very serious concerns about patient safety. He asked, who should the public believe, the Prime Minister or A&E doctors? May responded, it is right that the NHS was better prepared this winter than it ever has been before, citing statistics on extra beds, and saying 2.8 million more people were going to A&E a year than in 2010. The Prime Minister added, our NHS is indeed providing for patients. There are winter pressures. We were prepared for those winter pressures, and we will ensure, as we have done every year under this Conservative government, that the NHS receives more funding. After Corbyn asked a question about the numbers of patients having to wait 12 hours or more at emergency departments, May replied by giving statistics saying many more people in Wales had been forced to wait that long. Corbyn responded, the Prime Minister is responsible for the underfunding of the Welsh Government. Despite that, the overall Welsh Labour health budget has grown by 5% in 2016-17. After more skirmishes about patients dying because of delays to ambulances, the pair ended with passionate orations about the pressures facing the NHS, both greeted noisily by their respective MPs. Mentioning a man who had contacted him saying his 93-year-old father had waited 4 hours for an ambulance, Corbyn said, these are not isolated cases. These are common parlance all over the country. It needs money, it needs support, and it needs it now. The Prime Minister is frankly in denial about the state of the NHS. Even the absent Foreign Secretary recognizes it, but the Prime Minister isn't listening. People using the NHS can see from their own experience it's being starved of resources. People are dying unnecessarily in the back of ambulances and in hospital corridors. GP numbers are down. Nurses are leaving. The NHS is in crisis. Tory MPs might not like it, but I ask this question of the Prime Minister, when is she going to face up to the reality and take action to save the NHS from death by 1,000 cuts? May replied by saying, there is only one part of the NHS that has seen a cut in its funding, it's the NHS in Wales under a Labour government. Ministers rebuke Boris Johnson over NHS funding demands. Cabinet colleagues argue Foreign Secretary is playing into Labour's hands and stress need for trust. Boris Johnson has been accused by senior Conservative colleagues of playing into the hands of political opponents during a tetchy cabinet session that also brought a rebuke from Theresa May. The Prime Minister and almost all of her senior ministers took it in turns to stress the importance of keeping the high-level discussions confidential after being irritated by a series of pre-briefed news articles. Allies of Johnson were widely quoted revealing his plans to use the cabinet meeting to demand £100 million extra a week, or £5bn a year, for the NHS after Brexit. Amber Rudd, the Home Secretary, took the most direct approach as she stressed the importance of trust between those seated at the cabinet table, according to one person present. I'm talking to you, Foreign Secretary, she reportedly said. May introduced the session with a similar warning. The Prime Minister and a large number of cabinet ministers made the point that cabinet discussions should take place in private, her official spokesman said, in comments widely seen as a telling off of the Foreign Secretary. One source claimed that Johnson was admonished indirectly by almost all cabinet ministers who contributed to the health discussion, with the notable exception of his Vote Leave colleague Michael Gove. A number are said to have argued that such pre-briefing would simply hand political advantage to Labour, and that the Tories should not throw out funding figures before making clear where the money would come from. Even the Leave campaigner Chris Grayling, who backed Johnson's call for a Brexit dividend to be spent on the NHS, suggested it would be more politically astute to make such arguments closer to the next election. Could Boris Johnson's self-interest end up helping the NHS? However, Johnson, who argued that extra funding would help the Tories take on Labour in a future election, was backed up by Gove. And while the Foreign Secretary was criticized for making his demands public in advance, sources said his argument for money to be diverted from the EU to the NHS received support from several figures. The Prime Minister's spokesman said May raised the issue in her opening comments. Regarding the future and how any return of the EU contribution would be spent, the Prime Minister reminded Cabinet that the government has consistently said we will spend money on our priorities such as housing, schools, and the NHS, he said. May told her team she was working with Philip Hammond, the Chancellor, and Jeremy Hunt, the Health and Social Care Secretary, to ensure continued investment in the NHS, but she also stressed that the government had given the NHS an additional £6 billion in the budget only a few weeks ago. Her spokesman highlighted efficiency reviews in the NHS and plans to integrate social care and health, and pointed to the next government spending round. That will take place in 2018 but will only issue funding for 2020 and beyond. He said no cabinet member raised any specific number in relation to NHS funding, despite a widespread suggestion that Johnson would demand the figure of £100 million a week more. The Foreign Secretary is said to be frustrated by a claim that key aides to May had argued Labour was too far ahead on the NHS to make it worth prioritising. He is also keen to fulfil the promises he made as a leading figure in the Vote Leave campaign. Johnson first ramped up pressure on May over the issue in a Guardian interview this month in which he said the campaign's claim that Brexit could free up £350 million a week for the NHS was an underestimate, and argued it was important to spend large chunks of that sum on health services. A friend of the Foreign Secretary was quoted on Politics Home website as suggesting the decision to brief reporters before the cabinet meeting came from a staff member after Johnson raised the issue excitedly in the office. They said the minister felt very strongly about the suggestions he lied about the £350 million stuff but added that he had been given a hard time at cabinet. They suggested Johnson had messed up but would now move on. While cabinet members expressed their frustration at the meeting, Hammond hit back in Brussels before a meeting of finance ministers, stressing that Johnson was the Foreign Secretary rather than someone involved in health policy. I gave the Health Secretary Jeremy Hunt an extra £6 billion in the recent budget and we will look at departmental allocations again at the spending review when that takes place, Hammond told reporters. The cabinet discussion came after a winter update on the NHS led by May and then Hunt at which the group discussed the significant pressure of the worst flu outbreak in a number of years. They heard that flu admissions in the first week of 2018 were approaching double the number seen in 2010-11 during the swine flu epidemic. The government claims to have made the most extensive preparations ever for the winter period, and ministers heard that improvements to the 111 phone line had diverted an estimated 2.3 million people from A&E while an extra 1 million had been given flu vaccinations. Hunt, who was among those stressing the importance of private conversations, later appeared to back Johnson's call for extra NHS spending as he gave evidence to the House of Commons Health Select Committee. Asked whether he supported Johnson's demands for an extra £100 million a week for health, he said, "I don't think any health secretary is ever going to not support potential extra resources for his or her department." He added, "Let's say that there's a Brexit debate and there's an NHS debate and just occasionally those two debates come together." However, pressed on where the money would come from for a Brexit dividend for the NHS, Hunt said, "I think that is a question for the Foreign Secretary." For more daily robot news like then sub and don't forget to ring my bell.